with the text. The text that I have in mind is Vladimir Putin's essay of last July, which was titled On the Historical Unity of Ukraine and Russia. I'm sure he put Russia first, but you get the idea. So what I'm not going to do in this talk is engage directly with that text, and I'll just take a moment to explain why I'm not going to do that. But in the introduction to that book, Reconstruction of Nations, I write about myth. I write about engaging with myth as being like dancing with a skeleton. In other words, your own actions in some way are what keep the old bones in motion. So it's important not to engage directly with myth because it's your lively energy that keeps the myth going. I think what's crucial to be able to do instead is to speak about history in such a way that the myth falls away or the myth loses its central place in our imagination. And that's more what I'll be trying to do.
The truth is what you're willing to take a risk for. Truth is what you're willing to put yourself behind. Right?
I'm only going to engage with Mr. Putin's essay in the sense that I will speak a few words about its title, which I think is frankly enough. So if you just think about the title of Mr. Putin's essay, that's really enough to see how it doesn't work and cannot work as any kind of serious argument. The title is On the Historical Unity of Russia and Ukraine. Really, the whole problem with the essay can be concentrated on just that first word, on. So when you write a book or an essay or something which begins with the word on, the implicit axiom is that what follows the word on exists. That's the trick, right? So if I write a book called On something, like On Tyranny or something like this, then the assumption is that the thing that follows the word on exists. But what if the thing that follows the word on doesn't exist? Well, we'll just read through it and we'll imagine that it does exist. And that's the trick that the title of this essay plays. When you write on, let's say I write an essay called On, my numerous chess encounters with Garry Kasparov. I never had any numerous chess encounters with Garry Kasparov, right? On there is performing the role of a fiction. And that's what it's doing in this essay as well. So the on is the trick, right? The on is the presumption. The on is the conceit. The on is what conceals the basic falsehood of the premise. And then just to finish with the title, I'll leave the word the alone. I'll let him have the, but historical unity. There is no such thing as historical unity. History is not there to bring about unity or anything else. If you speak about historical unity of Russia and Ukraine or about anything else, it doesn't matter. You're ascribing to history a telos. You're ascribing to history a goal, a purpose. You're saying that history moves in a certain direction towards a certain end, and that's simply not true. If you believe that, then what you're believing it about is not history. It's a structure of faith. It's something else, but it's not history. So the moment that one is describing something as historical unity, one knows that one is in the grasp of a myth or of memory or of some kind of political memorialization. So the final thing that I want to say about this essay before I move on to the history of Ukraine has to do with its direction. So when we read this as a document, we might forget where it comes from. Where it's coming from is from the dictator of a neighboring country. So if the essay that Mr. Putin published was written by a schoolboy, in Novosibirsk or something, that would be one thing. But when it's written by the ruler of Ukraine's neighbor, that makes it imperialism. If the leader of one country claims, using whatever sort of argument, that another country does not exist, that's imperialism. And in practice, the method that the essay uses, and the method that day-to-day Russian propaganda uses, is ethno-nationalism, namely the notion that people who speak Russian must in some sense be Russian and must in some sense then fall under the purview of Russian politics. Russian speakers in the Russian Federation are more repressed than Russian speakers in Ukraine, or for that matter, pretty much any other country. So the ethno-nationalism is a way of presenting the world which strikes us maybe as commonsensical, but is actually propaganda which serves these two kinds of purposes. Now, what I want to suggest is that that's a form of propaganda. Ethno-nationalism is a form of propaganda that does two things. It inspires magical thinking about language and identity, and also inspires magical thinking about language and repression. So the magical thinking about language and identity is that they are somehow the same thing, which of course they're not. I'm speaking English now. Many of you, I presume, are native English speakers, but most of the people who speak English in this conversation, and for that matter around the world, are not English. That's just a very brute and simple fact. Language does not define identity. And by the same token, there are plenty of people who speak various languages, including Russian, who do not identify with the Russian Federation. So that's the magical thinking about identity. The magical thinking about politics or about repression is that if you're speaking a language beyond the borders of the country named after that language, you're somehow repressed. But again, that's just magical thinking. There's no empirical basis for thinking anything like that. If we just check it for a moment, we can see that it's clearly not always the case. People who speak Russian in country A can be more oppressed than people who speak Russian in country B, even if country A happens to be called Russia.
But I think it's very important to recognize that this doesn't come down to who really, when a Viking warlord called Valdemar baptized himself maybe 1,000 years ago after having flirted with Islam and Judaism and Western Christianity. When a Viking warlord called Valdemar married a Byzantine princess, even though he already had 8 wives, or maybe it was 6, and 800 concubines, or maybe it was 600, that moment didn't define whether Russia and Ukraine and Belarus are, it's not about disputing the meaning of Valdemar baptizing himself, right? That's not what this is really about. A story, because here's the thing, the story that is told by Mr. Putin about how a baptism 1,000 years ago, and I've tried to give you some of the colorful details because it's the colorful details that remind us what history and life are really like, right? But this kind of story that Mr. Putin is telling is a basically fascist story. It's a story about how once upon a time, nothing was fragmented. There was purity. Someone got baptized. There was water. They were purified. Everything was purified. And his name was Vladimir. And my name is also Vladimir. That is quite literally the story. That is the story. It has been said in basically so many words. He's also said it at the length of 7,000 words in a published paper. But that is basically the story. And that is a fascist story. The story that the world was once united. The story that the world was once united and pure, but it has been fragmented and broken by outsiders. That is Mr. Putin's version. The version is that everything which is Ukraine comes from outside. It's the Poles, it's the Germans, it's the Austrians, it's the Americans. That's all artificial. And so if you can just strip that away, then you come back to the real story, the unity, this imagination that he has about the last 1,000 years. The thing is, his story of the last 1,000 years has everything in it except for the facts. And in order to strip away the facts, as Sergei quite rightly said, you have to strip away the people. You have to kill all the people who have been produced by history as it actually has been. You have to physically eliminate all of the variety which allows people to speak of belonging to a nation and doing the small things that make a nation real. And that is the relationship between Putin's story and this invasion. It is about getting rid of the Ukrainian nation as it has actually been created by history and trying to move towards this vision of purity, where there's no contingency left, there's no difference left, there's no variety left. There's just this kind of what Mr. Putin himself calls this kind of historical unity. So that's one kind of story and where it leads. And so that's why I wanted to stress that it isn't a battle of stories in the sense that we have to decide what that baptism 1,000 years ago really meant. I think it's more important to recognize that there's one kind of story which leads in this horribly homogenizing direction, which justifies violence. And then there's a different kind of story which is basically saying, we're here. We're here. In Mr. Putin's declaration of war a couple of Thursdays ago, and in a number of statements since, what he has done has been to claim that this war is about, and I hate to even repeat this because it's so absurd and grotesque, and it's such a moral atrocity, honestly, that this concept is even in the world. Every justification that's been given for this invasion just makes it worse. The truth is what you're willing to take a risk for. Truth is what you're willing to put yourself behind. In Mr. Putin's declaration of war a couple of Thursdays ago, and in a number of statements since, what he has done has been to claim that this war is about, and I hate to even repeat this because it's so absurd and grotesque, and it's such a moral atrocity, honestly, that this concept is even in the world. Every justification that's been given for this invasion just makes it worse.